All right, here I am with Brother Anthony Rogers. Anthony, how are you? Tony, I should say.
Yeah, I'm doing great. It's fine. Obviously, you know me as Tony. Most people online know me as Anthony, but either works. I respond to both.
Okay, good. And uh, and so, just to summarize, you are an ordained minister in the PCA and serving there in South Carolina, but you travel, don't you?
Oh yeah. Throughout the state for the prison work, and then of course for extracurricular activities, related to apologetics and so forth.
Yeah. So, with regard to the prison ministry, like what have you been doing?
So COVID has shut down the prisons, which means we can't go uh, into the prisons, speak to prisoners face to face. That means then that all of the other work that we have that most people wouldn't think of, right? If you talk about prison work, they're just thinking of what you would do in the prison, but there's a lot of stuff prior to that or in addition to that that's done outside the prison, administrative type stuff, as well as one of the things we do is we gather mentors who can pair off with prisoners and help them. And that means then that we go to churches and we tell people about the prison work and petition people to sign up, if you will, to be a mentor or to be one of our corresponding disciplers. So a mentor is somebody who goes in and speaks one-on-one with a prisoner, becomes a friend to the prisoner, or really a mentor friend, and talk to them about the Lord, teach them scripture, but also teach them certain skills and life lessons that might be helpful for them if they're going to get out. Also, we go around and minister to their families. The people that are in the prison came from families, and in some cases, maybe broken families, but we do all sorts of things related to that. There might need to be reconciliation, for example, between various parties, and they're going to be getting out at some point, and they're going to need somewhere to go, or they're going to be going back somewhere. And if they're just going back to the same troubled environment, then it's a good chance they could turn around and be back where they are. So there's just a lot of different things that can be done outside of the prison as well. But also the prisoners still have some means of communication. So some of them have access to email, and some of them are obviously able to call. So there are also those sorts of things that I do. But some of the main stuff I've been doing is I've been taught by through the process of becoming a minister. One of the things that was drilled into me really well, for which I'm thankful, is being eminently prepared. And so one pastor in particular, for example, he would show me the list of all the sermons he was going to preach that year. He had them planned out. He was going to preach this text this Sunday, this text, this text, this text. Now that could be interrupted. There could be a reason why he needs to bring a different sermon. Something's going on in the church there, or whatever it may be. But generally speaking, this is the plan, and he's already got these passages outlined, what he's going to preach. And part of the idea for that is you don't know what's going to happen. So if something happens, he's ready to preach without having neglected this other issue. It's not like he says, I have to finish this by Sunday. Oh, there's been a death in the congregation. What do I do? Well, obviously you have to go minister to that situation. But the preaching could suffer for it unless you were prepared. So I learned from those sorts of things to be really prepared. Plus, Dr. Pipa, who was the president of Greenville Seminary, I recently retired. He would preach at the beginning of every school year a sermon on the book of James, where James tells people not to be presumptuous and say, we're going to go here and do this or that and so forth. But what we should say, James says, if the Lord wills. And in context, James is, speaking against presumptuousness. And so the Dr. Pipa would often preach a sermon on that and tell students, if you come to us the last day of the semester and tell us you got sick that week and you couldn't finish your term paper, he says that's not going to be accepted as a legitimate excuse because you were told what the term paper was at the beginning of the semester. So there might be some circumstances that will allow, we'll say this is a legitimate excuse for why this or that wasn't done, but in the main, they taught us to be really prepared. So that was a long way of saying that I do a lot of work preparing for when the prisons do open. I'll have Bible studies prepared, devotional material to give to the prisoners to be using regularly, and Bibles, sermons, just everything that I can think of that will be of use in the prisons.
And these are like maximum security, medium security, all kinds of different.
Yeah, everything. So every prison in the state, there are 21 prisons in South Carolina. So
okay, wow.
Except the federal prisons. That doesn't mean I won't go to those eventually, but presently we're focused on just the state prisons.
Okay. And so you're also doing work with, let's see, David Wood and Ligonier Ministries, and you've got like 19 jobs, and you're a dad, right? You've got 4 altogether? Am I right?
Yes. Yep. 4 kids, other jobs as well. So the work I do with David is primarily apologetics oriented and focuses on Islam. And then I have my own YouTube channel that I'm now starting to spend or focus some time on, because I like to address additional issues besides just Islam, and even some issues that aren't apologetical at all, just biblical issues that I think are good for Christians to know. So yeah, I do a bunch of stuff.
I've been watching your Genesis 126 materials just recently. I'm catching up. I see the notification that you've gone on live. I have the option of either, on Saturday nights preparing for my sermon.
Right.
Or watching you. So sometimes it's an admixture, and and maybe that's why the sermons haven't been that great. All right. Well, so we know each other because you are a renowned Trinitarian apologist. You've sort of put a pole in the sand in that regard, and we've got, we became friends with regard to those issues because we have similar interests. And you came to Northwest Hills Church. Was it last year or the year before? I can't remember.
I think it was the year before.
Yeah, I'd love to get you out here again. I just have to persuade our elder board. But you gave your testimony on Sunday morning at Northwest Hills, I think during the Sunday school hour. And I probably heard from 24 people saying, that was the most amazing testimony I've ever heard. That was a testimony of biblical proportions. It was as if the woman at the well was sort of giving her testimony. And so normally we record everything, for the sermon, and mostly we record Sunday school, but somebody dropped the ball and we didn't record it. And for the last year and a half or so, I've been kicking myself for that, because there's been many times when I wanted to give that to someone or just review it for my own edification. So I was hoping that you would be able to give us that presentation here for the benefit of those who would watch.
Sure. Well, as you know, people never tell the same story the same exact way twice. Sometimes they include details that were left out, or they leave out details that were originally included. But I'll do my best to duplicate that. So I grew up in Southern California. I was born to, my maternal side is Sicilian, and my father's side is a mixture but I didn't really know that side too much. I knew my dad. My dad was always there, but the family beyond him was never much involved in our life, so I didn't know them. I only knew the Sicilian side, really, with some exceptions. I mean, I did meet some of his family members here and there, but they never played any significant role in our life. So the reason I mention that is because that in many ways influenced my mindset when it came to things I would do later in life. My family was a great family, very loyal and so forth, but they also had a lot of the attributes that go along with what many people would think of when you think of Sicilians, especially coming to America back in, earlier time, because they came here in the 1900s. And I should have, maybe I'll give you some links if you put this up in a YouTube video for people to look at. But you go back in my family history. Our family originally came here, like I said, in the 1900s and moved back east. They lived in Ohio. And my great uncle was, his name was Salvatore Tillacco, and he was the lieutenant of Lou Perello, who was the considered the original godfather of the Cleveland Mafia. They were both gunned down in Little Italy there in Ohio, in a restaurant on Murray Hill, I believe. And so, I mean, you could see, I even have pictures of the graves there where Lou Perello and my relative are buried right by each other. They have these big mausoleums noting the graves and so forth. But so without getting into all the details, my grandfather eventually went west. And part of that just is that it's a striking thing to me when I think about it, every time I think about it. But basically, my grandfather at one point had a mistress, and something happened between my grandfather and my grandmother that caused him to separate from her. He had the mistress even before separating, but something happened where there was a rift between him and my grandmother, and he went to be with the mistress, and then he announced that he was going to divorce my grandmother. Well, the family, and remember, this is why I say this is a striking contrast to me. Remember, the family was in the family business, right? So you wouldn't think upstanding or, any of the other things that go along with that. But as soon as he announced that he was going to divorce my grandmother, everybody was up in arms, because you can't do that. They were all good Catholics, you see. And so mistress okay, divorce not okay. And what that meant was they not only clamped down and said he couldn't divorce my grandmother, but he had to get rid of the mistress. So in order to ensure that, they forced him to go west. He had to move. That's how much control the family had. He went west and never had anything to do beyond that, to my knowledge, with the family, that background that I just described. I didn't grow up as part of that. However, I did grow up around people who had every bit the attitude that you'd see in one of those movies. I remember my Uncle Milo would come over to my grandpa's house. We would have big family gatherings. Other people would come too. But I remember my Uncle Milo would come over, and I just kept thinking, this guy reminds me of these people in the movies, right? He reminds me of Joe Pesci or one of these guys on Goodfellas, or he reminds me of Pacino, but he had a stroke, many years before I can remember. And so it was really interesting. He had all of the attitude and the just everything that goes along with that picture, but only one side of his body would work, but he would. So, I mean, I'm not laughing at a stroke, but I'm saying he just, it was interesting to me growing up, seeing somebody that had so much attitude, but was so physically incapable of certain, things, although I'm sure if, he was in a situation, his right arm would have worked as.
Yeah. He had the machismo though.
Oh yeah. And my grandfather, just to give one story that kind of gives you an insight into this, my parents started a business at one point in California. They started a skating rink. And in those days, there were a lot of gay bars popping up all over California. It was it was a whole boom for that kind of activity there. And we were trying to get the business going, and because there was a gay bar next door, it affected people coming to our skating rink, because parents and families and other people didn't want to come, and they were near each other enough that it was a concern to certain people, right? So and then on top of it, they were using our parking lot without permission, and so my dad had asked them, just to not park in our parking lot. It was for customers and so forth, but they just sort of turned their nose up. Well, my grandfather, you don't do that. So he came the next day, and he had his shotgun, and he sat on top of the roof with his shotgun, basically telling them nobody better come on this property. And so my parents eventually sold the skating rink because they thought, he's going to kill somebody, and we just need to get him out of here, right? So we just need to take him back home and just make a living a different way.
That might have been the first time somebody was shot at a skating rink.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, but so I mention all of that because, so here I am. I grew up in this context, loved my family. I'm influenced by just the whole atmosphere, right? Even if they're not engaging in particular activity officially or unofficially. I mean, they weren't engaged in that kind of stuff, but they had every bit that background and mindset and so forth. And so at the same time in California, gangs were just spreading and surging throughout California. And I quickly fell in with that whole crowd. I thought, I thought this was the thing to do. And so I became involved in gangs and all sorts of gang activity. And it became so bad that my parents eventually decided that we needed to move away from California. Now, the thinking here, and you'll recognize this, the thinking here is that his problem is his environment. Now, I spent a bit of time talking about my upbringing, which to some degree, gets into that issue. But as you know, the real problem is the heart. And, God can use external things as restraints or, to exacerbate those sinful inclinations and so forth. And in this case, my own orientation towards sin was all the more exacerbated rather than restrained. And it just manifested itself in gang activity. And my parents thought that the solution would be to change my environment. But of course, that can't change the heart, right?
So they decided to move you out to Provo, Utah.
They moved us from... would have made a bit more sense, although I could imagine becoming a terror to the hapless Mormons who never but they moved me to Vegas, which it is different than California in that California has, it's like one rolling city in my mind. You can pass from city to city without knowing you've left, unless you saw a sign saying you're now in Placentia or La Puente or Norwalk, you wouldn't know you moved from one city to another. In Vegas, it's just Vegas. Well, now they have things like Henderson, but it's pretty self-contained. There's not really anything outside of it. And so if you're going to do anything, it's going to have to be available in Vegas to do. But Vegas has its crime, obviously. In fact, maybe if I think about it, I'll tell you an ironic story. So we go there, and I stayed out of trouble for a couple of months until I met other friends that were like the friends I had in California, and started engaging in the same sorts of activities and up the ante to some degree. But one of the things that I did as part of my criminal activity was steal cars. And it was so bad. I mean, it had nothing to do with a desire money. It didn't have anything to do with what a lot of people may think. I simply had a love for the act itself, the crime. And this is one of the things that's later going to come back to haunt me, and ultimately lead to my conversion by God's grace. But I stole cars, and it was so bad that like sometimes here's an you think of people stealing for money or stealing for what money can get them, like drugs. It was the opposite in my case. I would use money to try and commit a crime and maybe lose money, or I only did it for a brief period. But as far as doing drugs, I wasn't really a big drug user. I used to drink and stuff like that, but I wasn't a big drug user. It wasn't until I realized, if I had used something like methamphetamine or cocaine, I could stay up longer and commit more acts of, theft or what have you. So, that drug use period was a relatively brief period. But the criminal activity was my whole life. I mean, but as far as stealing cars and everything, I probably stole as many cars as could fit in a Walmart parking lot. One of the things I would do, just to show you how bad it was, there were nights I would go out and I would take cars, and I would take a car and then I would park it in the neighbor's driveway 3 houses down. Right. It was being able to do it that thrilled me to no end. And then, of course, I would joyride in the cars. I would take other cars and keep them and not return them. But I'd never take them to a chop shop or anything like that. They were just, they were just an occasion for me to commit these crimes, which, gave me a certain thrill. Well, so eventually I stole a car, and it's interesting. I was with another Italian who actually looked like me. A lot of people said we looked alike and thought we were brothers. And one day we went and took somebody's car. I went in the person's garage and took their car out of it. And the person came out of their garage as soon as I was pulling out, and my friend was getting in the car. And so he looked right at my friend and this guy looked right at each other. The windows had tint, so he didn't see me. Well, later, I wasn't driving. Somebody else was driving the car. This was like a month later, really. And everybody, so the cops were chasing the car. Everybody got out and ran, and I ran as well, of course. And later I was found in a store, just shopping. I was just shopping. But the cops, they're like, no, you're the guy or whatever. And they had the person whose car it was come, and he didn't even see me. He's not going to identify me. But if you recall, the friend that he did see looks like me. And so even though I was there, my whole point is, it's still to this day, I look back and I think, he didn't see me. He saw my friend. But he identified me as the person who took his car. However, what ended up happening was when I went to court, I found out that the person whose car it was Floyd Lamb Jr. Now, anybody who's familiar with Nevada and especially Vegas history will recognize that name, Lamb. For one, they have a whole street named after the family, Lamb Boulevard in Las Vegas, as well as Floyd Lamb Park. So there's a whole park named after them. But basically, the family is politically connected there and has been for a long time. One of them was a senator or some political official, but another like 30 years. And this was the son of that family. And he actually dropped the charges in my case. He dropped the charges saying he feared for his family's safety. Allegedly he knew about me and just said he just wanted to drop the issue. I don't know what really accounted for all of that, but that was his own explanation and why he dropped it.
Could there have been some kind of mafioso that, put a horse head in his bed or something?
So my grandfather was still alive back then, and there were times when he would get me out of trouble. In fact, the next time I got in trouble, he got me a lawyer, but the lawyer wanted me to do a polygraph. The polygraph, he says, is not useful in court. He says, but it would be helpful, for other reasons. Maybe they'd be inclined to ask the lie detector and that sort of thing. So, I mean, I know my grandfather would be involved in certain ways when these things would happen. And that's possible. I don't know what it was that led him to drop the charges. I never heard anything about my grandfather doing anything to, twist anybody's arm or anything, but I just knew that I was surprised. I fully expected I was caught. But this sort of thing, actually, all it did was reinforce my behavior. I started thinking, because I had already thought, nobody catches me, I can't get caught. I would get chased by the police all the time, never get caught. Even the time I got caught, here was my excuse: they didn't really see me, they saw my friend. So that was a fluke, right? And then when the police got me, that was just based on that misidentification, but they never catch me. And so now when I am released, I'm thinking, that just proves I'm unstoppable, right? And that just propelled me. And remember, I mean, I'm only giving you one aspect of the criminal activity, the car theft things, but I was a gangbanger. I was fighting people and doing other things, and the cars were also useful in those sorts of things as well.
Let me ask you. So during this time, what was your view of God and in religion, and what did you think about those things?
Yeah, so since my background was Sicilian, the family was but that doesn't mean a whole lot, right? There can be ranges of participation. And typically what it means in the case of most Catholics is they would go to church on a couple of occasions a year, Christmas, Easter. Maybe if they were really good, they would go to confession once a year. And if they were really, really good, they would go to mass, more often. But our family didn't go very often. There was just this sort of traditionalism. We're Catholics, we're Sicilian. That's what we are. But I don't recall any prayers to Mary or prayers to anyone, really. There was no family worship, no family discussions about God. But my mom, at one point while I was growing up, did leave the Catholic Church, and this did at least do something that'll be significant later on. My mom leaves the Catholic Church because my mom was the one exception active with the nuns throughout her childhood and growing up, especially when they lived back east before they moved to California. And at one point she was asked by the nuns, they said, "Hey, will you teach a Bible study to the ladies?" And my mom stopped and she's like, "I can't teach a Bible study. I don't know the Bible." And that just shocked her to her core, because she realized, I've been a Catholic all these years. I've been active with the nuns. None of my other family members, I don't know the Bible. And she realized there's a problem here. So she left and started going to Protestant churches. So at least when I was growing up, it meant this. My mom, when she taught me to read, she used the Bible. She used a King James Bible to teach me how to read. And even though I was a terrible student because I wouldn't do any of the work, the one thing I always could do and had no difficulty doing was reading. I could read like nobody's business. I mean, just saying that reading just was an easy, natural thing to me. But I didn't do that either. I didn't make use of that, right? By the time I was 18, I had read 2 books in my life besides, the Bible and stuff like that. But James and the Giant Peach and The Call of the Wild, but I could read, like if I was asked to read something in a class, I could read it. Other settings, but I wouldn't read on my own. That just wasn't something I would do. And so I did have some experience in Protestant churches, but these were always just sporadic. Like we would go for a couple of months at a time, and then we wouldn't go. And I think by the time I was like 13, we didn't go to a church again between then and the time I was converted at 19. Right. So most of my teen years just weren't at church. And even prior to that, it was just sporadic attendance. We would go to things like Calvary Chapel. I went to Calvary Chapel in Costa Mesa, where Chuck Smith used to be the pastor. I could still remember his voice to this day. Most of the time during the services. So
what was your reflections on those?
Oh, yeah. Sorry. So I'm the king of tangents and long-winded answers. So if anybody were to have asked me, are you a Christian or something like that, I would have said yes, but I had no real clue. I didn't, even though I had, would have had this Catholic background and then to some extent a Protestant background. If somebody asked me to Trinity, I wouldn't have even known what that is. If they asked me about the deity of Christ, his incarnation, I wouldn't have known what that is. But if somebody asked me if I believed in God, I would have said yes, and I would have thought that I was believing in the Christian God. But I really never reflected on it. In fact, one of the things that I did a lot that was just downright blasphemous was I used to think it was funny to pretend that I am God or something like. You've heard people, they say things, somebody will use the Lord's name in a way like, and they'll mention God's name, and then the other person will say, yes, you called. I was that sort of person, right? Running around just thinking that I was the master of my fate, the captain of the ship, and just incredible arrogance and so forth. But yeah, I didn't really reflect much on anything. I just kind of thought, I compartmentalized everything, right? I would have thought I was a Christian without knowing what Christianity is, and never really reflected on what's going to happen to this criminal if he goes and stands before the God he admittedly doesn't really know, right? Couldn't define him if you asked him to. And that's so I'll just skip ahead here. I've given you the long preparatory to this, but I eventually do get arrested. And I'm charged. I had been arrested several times. The one time I got the charges dropped, but another time I was given probation for 18. It was a suspended sentence. If I stay out of trouble, then I get off of probation in a couple of years. If I don't do probation and pass through, then I have to go do 18 months in prison. But while I was doing the probation, I committed another crime, and probation. But then in addition to that, I got 5 years for that other crime. So it was 18 months plus 5 years. And
of probation.
There's another crime that was involved in there too, which was
Of probation, 5 years of probation.
No. So I got the first crime. This all happened in a really brief period. So what happens is I got caught for a car. I went to jail. They let me out on my own to court. And the judge decides that I'll get an 18-month suspended sentence. If I complete probation, then I don't have to do that 18 months. If I break the probation, I have to do 18 months in prison. While I was going to court, though, I got in trouble again. And so they give me probation. Now I get out on this other crime too. You know, my grandfather comes along, you know, I get out of prison, and I mean, I get out of jail, not in prison. Other cases going on. Now I've got this new case. Okay. And they don't seem to be connecting the dots here that I've got these two charges, right? So they give me probation. I've got this other case. Then I go to court on this case, and they're going to put me in prison. But what they say is, no, wait a minute. You know, he just got probation. He didn't even get a chance to see if he could do probation, you know? So they decide, they leave me on probation. You know, other court case, you know, so I have this other crime. And so when I get out, what happened was one of the terms of my probation was that I couldn't have or be around guns. And my brother had a legal firearm, a legally registered firearm. And so he had to get rid of it. And stupid of me to do, but I went with him to get rid of it, right? He was taking it to a friend's house. And what ended up happening was he got in an argument with a clerk. You know, I guess we just looked like thugs, and the guy, you know, wanted to kick us out or something. And so the store clerk, you know, got uppity, and I was holding my brother's gun, and I pulled it out, and because the store clerk went in the back and grabbed a shotgun, and I pulled out my brother's 9mm, and nothing happened. You know, I didn't shoot the guy or anything, but we left the store, and next thing I know, a gang unit was surrounding us. There were gang units in Vegas, and unit arrested me, and that was the final straw. It revoked the terms of my probation. It gave me a new charge, ex-felon in possession of a firearm, because the 18-month sentence was for a felony. So was the second sentence for 5 years was for a felony. And actually, all those, whenever they get you for one felony, they usually get you for 5 or 6, because every crime really involves more than one crime. You know, so the theft of a car involves, when they if they catch you in the car and charged with grand larceny of auto or grand theft auto, possession of stolen vehicle, because a person can possess stolen property and not be the one who took it. So those are two separate crimes. So if you stole it and you're in possession of it, you've got 2 felonies. And then anything inside the car. So in some cases, the cars had credit cards in them. So possession of credit card without credit card holders' consent was one of the charges. I can't remember all the charges they gave me, but they gave me a lot of charges, including the gun charge. And to the times I was caught, I had a gun on me. So here's where it all starts to come to a head. So I'm in the prison. I mean, I'm in the jail. First, I'm in jail before they transfer me to the prison. I'm in the jail for 2 months because I'm still finishing some of these other court cases. And while I'm in the jail, I've got a lot of time. You know, I'm still at this point, like, one of the things I didn't describe is what started psychologically with me during this whole thing. I was so used to committing crimes and watching out for the police and that sort of thing that even in the jail, when I would go to sleep, I would be, it's kind of hard to you have to kind of visualize, you know, the activity I'm engaged in is mostly stealing cars and stuff like that. So I'm constantly looking out for the cops. So even in my sleep, I'd find myself squinting, like looking in the rear view mirror, right? Thinking the cops are after me and stuff like that. And I go into the jail and I'm surrounded by other people on the streets. You can deal with certain situations. You can, you can put yourself in situations and take yourself out of situations. In the jail, you're in the situation. It's 24/7. There is no removing yourself from it. And, so it was a whole different thing. So this now becomes my new context. And, I'm thinking, how did I get caught? This is, devastating me, and while I was there, I was put in a jail cell with a self-professed devil worshiper. Okay. Now the guy was actually very nice as far as, just, being cordial and so forth, but he claimed to be a devil worshiper, and he started telling me stuff about the Bible, and his intention was to ridicule it and so forth. And while he's telling me this, I'm like, I didn't believe him. And he says, well, get a Bible and I'll show you. And I said, well, I don't know how to get a Bible. And he goes, here. So he got one of these kites. They're called kites, and you fill them out and you request a Bible. And I still remember to this day the lady's name. She's probably not alive still, because this was I went into the jail in 1992. Her name was, and she was very old at the time, her name was Bonnie Polly. So I still remember the name of the lady whose face I never saw, but her ministry was to provide Bibles to prisoners. So that's how she did. I mean, I don't know what else she might have done, but that was something that she did. She provided Bibles, the jails and the prisons for that. So I get this Bible, and this inmate, as an example of what he would do is I would wake up and I'd look up on the ceiling above me, and he had drawn a pentagram above me. He'd do all this crazy stuff in there. So he told me how to get a Bible. I got a Bible. And when I got it, he couldn't show me any of the stuff that he was trying to say. But now I've got this Bible and I've got a bunch of time. What else am I going to do? Right. So I said, okay, I'll read this. Then, and as I'm reading it, it started to impact me in certain ways. In the first place, I realized the holiness of God, right? I mean, I'm reading the Bible and I'm reading about his wrath towards sinners. You have, Adam and Eve eat a piece of fruit that God tells them not to eat, and he kicks them out of the garden, right? Obviously, my theology grows later, and I didn't understand as fully then what I understand now about Adam and Eve's original condition and the glories of it, right? And all that they lost. But I do see that God kicks them out of the garden just for eating a fruit. And I'm saying just right now, I don't see it as just. Now I realize they're transgressing the law of their maker, right? The one who gave them life and all the good things of paradise. And this is not a light or incidental thing. They take of this fruit, and he kicks them out of the garden. And that is even presented as a mercy, right? He could have just wiped them out, but he doesn't. He spares them. So there's some mercy there. But then I read in Genesis, it's not long until I get to Genesis 6, where God is destroying the entire world except for 8 people, right? And it's not long after that where I read that the nations of the world are banded together. They're not nations yet, right? But they're banded together, increase, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. They're trying to make a name for themselves, and God comes and destroys the tower that they're building, confuses their languages, and disperses them across the world. Then I read of other stories of God opening up the ground and swallowing whole families alive, fire shooting out of his presence, Leviticus 10, because people brought unauthorized fire into his presence. And it's just all of this is accumulating, and I'm thinking, here's heaven and earth who hates sin, is wrathful towards sinners and sin, and he's got all of heaven and earth at his disposal. And I'm thinking, what makes me think I'm going to escape his wrath? I didn't even escape the wrath of an earthly potentate, an earthly judge. And they're limited, and I did get away with it for a while, but how am I going to escape this God? He commands the winds and the waves, right? He is at his command. So this just terrified me to no end. And then, I mean, just other passages would strike me too, just teaching the character of God. One passage that, I mean, I literally almost fell out of my seat when I read this, but in Exodus 3, when I was reading it, God appears to Moses, tells him he's the God of his fathers. He made the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to be the God to their descendants after them. And he's come now in response to their cries and is going to deliver them. And Moses is like, well, and they're going to say, what's his name, right? I mean, they're going to ask me some questions. How am I going to prove to them that you sent me? So Moses says, what is your name that I may tell them? And then God replies, I am that I am, or I am who I am. Thus shall you say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. And I just remember that response just hit me. I was like, that's the most incredible answer I had ever heard. And I was like, what else would God say? Right. And I just sort of got right at that moment, like, he's saying, it's like, I am the self-contained one. I don't have to, he's not defining himself in terms of anything else, right? He's defining himself in terms of himself. He is the self-sufficient, self-existing, eternal God, right? You go tell them, I am the one who is, that one sent me to you. And I was just like, and I thought, this God, his majesty, his sovereignty, his power, his righteousness, his wrath towards sin. I mean, all of a sudden, and all I have, I'm not thinking about prisoners. I'm not thinking about how long I might be doing in prison. I'm not thinking about any other dangers that go along with this, any of the loss that I experienced. I don't have, the girlfriend I had outside or the friends that I had or any of the other activities. None of that mattered anymore. The only thing I could think of was that I was going to answer to this God, and in fact could answer to him at any moment. It's not as if being in prison meant that I was, free for a time, right? He could, cause this devil worshiper to behave like a devil worshiper instead of the nice guy he was acting like, and cut my throat in the middle of the night. But so I have all this time. Remember, I'm in the jail for 2 months. I had so much time that I read the entire Bible all the way through, because I'm now looking for an answer. I'm not now just, reading for entertainment. I'm frightened and I'm reading the Bible for an answer. But in my ever really arrive at the answer. I'm not saying it wasn't there. Obviously it's there, but I didn't get the memo, right? I read it and all I can hear is God is angry towards sinners. Sinners are going to die and face judgment and that sort of thing. So once I was finally sent to the prison, I was then, when you get sent to the prison, you get put in quarantine for a month. Quarantine means so in the jail, you get out at least for several hours a day. You can be in a general area there's like usually a contained area where there's the jail cells, and then there's a central area, and you can go in there and people watch TV or play cards or talk or whatever. So there is some distraction. But when you go to the prison and you go to quarantine for the first month before they put you into the general population, you're in a cell with one person for 23 hours. You only get out for 1 hour to shower and do whatever. So I have 23 hours now. And I read the entire Bible without understanding the gospel. All I understand is the righteousness of God, the holiness of God, and all of that. But while I was reading, I would hear people singing. I'd hear people singing outside through the window of the cell. And I'd ask somebody, who's that? What are they doing? And you would tell me it's the people in the chapel. They're in there having services. And so I kept thinking, I can't wait till I get out and I can go to a service and talk to somebody and ask them questions, and ended up happening was I actually, in God's providence, I was placed in a cell with a man who had become a Christian. He had been there for 10 years, and he was the one person. So in prison, there's what's called, you've heard of jailhouse religion. A lot of people do go into prison and for various reasons will start playing religion. Either they think they're going to get over on the parole board, or they think it's going to make things easier for them in prison. Maybe God is going to do them a favor. Religious. There are all sorts of reasons that people might want to do that when it's not genuine. But but this guy, I put in the cell with this guy who had the respect of all the prisoners and of the guards. I would even have guards say to me things like, I don't know if that Christianity stuff is real, but I know this, if it is, that guy's the genuine article, right? They'd point to him and they'd say, that man is, you don't hide the sort of person you are. A lot of people, it's like, when two people are maybe courting or something and they're trying to show themselves to be marriage material, they're presenting a certain face. And you want to get through that, right? You want to make sure you're finding out who this person really is, but or the families, however this marriage is working, out. But in the prison, you don't go anywhere. It's just like these people eventually get married and find out who the other person really is. You don't go anywhere. They see everything that you're doing, and he just had the command and respect of everybody. So I'm in a prison cell with him, and we're reading the Bible together, and I'm going to the chapel in addition to that. And there was a Presbyterian minister coming out to the prison preaching. And through the course of this, I eventually learned the gospel. I learned the good news. And it often reminds me of what Paul says, faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. And he's specifically talking about preachers and preaching. Think of the word of God. It is the instrument that God uses to convict and convert people. That's the means that the Spirit uses to communicate repentance and faith. But there's a special blessing placed upon the preaching of the word. It's the preaching of the word that God especially blesses and uses to convict and convert people. Right. Now, I'm not saying the Bible alone won't lead people to that. And I'm certainly not, in terms of authority, the preacher's not preaching something other than the Bible. It is the Bible and they're preaching, but I mean, there's something about how God uses the ministry, the truth of the gospel through the word. And oh, you muted yourself.
Yeah. Going back to that time when you're in the cell and you've got the Bible, you're in there for all that time, and you're having this sort of realization of the holiness of God. There are some people who would say, well, how did you even know that the Bible would be a credible source from which to discern who God is, or that even that God is, right? What was your sort of thinking, in terms of that?
Yeah. So in my case, I understand some people approaching it that way. In my case, it arrested my attention. Everybody knows somebody that, like I was mentioning, the gentleman I was put in a cell with, he had like a presence about him, right? He had people, when he would come, and people would suddenly, people respected him, right? He was this exuded from him, and like if you were the sort of person that cuts another person off while you're talking, right? Like I'm talking and then you'd cut me off or something like that, or I'm like that. He was the sort of person where if he started talking, you'd just stop, right? I mean, he just had that kind of presence about him, and just a real character to him, a real depth. And it was really a sight to behold. And I'm an illustration of kind of what I'm getting at here. But when I pick up the Bible and I read it, it came to me as the voice of God. I'm not saying there's not reasons and evidences for believing the Bible. That's not my point at all. But, Jesus said in John 10, my sheep hear my voice. When I read the Bible, it spoke to me as if it were coming from the one who has absolute authority. It had self-attesting authority. And an example of that is what I gave in Exodus 3. It was like yeah, I mean, what else would I expect God to say? You know, I mean, that was just the most profound answer to me. And to this day, you know, I wouldn't pretend to have even plumbed the depths of that answer. You know, that's there God is giving his name. And like I said, it entails, among other things, his self-sufficiency. I am that I am. He's not looking, you know, he's defining himself in terms of himself, not in reference to anything else. If God had to define himself in reference to creation, right, then in some sense, the explanation upon, I'm not saying he can't point to creation and say, I'm the creator, because he certainly is. But there has to be something that's true of God even independently of creation, right? Because if he's the creator, then he existed without it. So what is it he could possibly point to define himself? And so it was just things like that. Like the Bible's coming to me and it's speaking to my condition. I couldn't deny what the Bible was saying about my heart. You know, I didn't touch on the sense of sin, and you know, I'm talking more about God's attributes and character, his holiness, his righteousness, and just taking for granted that everybody recognizes that I was sinful, and recognizing that. But you know, it spoke so accurately to my condition. I thought, you know, what else accounts? I did gloss over this and said I might mention it, but this kind of addresses it. One of the things that really bothered me when I was in the prison was I would listen to other people give their excuses for why they were there. I heard one person say, a bunch of people really say, you know, I came from, and so then I would sit there and I'd say, oh yeah, broken family. And I think, oh, wait a minute. I didn't come from a broken family. I grew up with a mother and father and had a good extended family, my grandparents and relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins. So no, that's not my excuse. Then I heard somebody say, well, I grew up, we were poor. And so I was like, yeah, that's my excuse. Then I was like, oh no, we weren't poor. You know, we weren't rich, but we weren't poor. I never had to steal. And I never stole because I stole because I liked stealing. And so these sorts of things, I would hear other people's excuses and they just started bothering me. And I was like, and now even those excuses aren't legitimate excuses, right? There are people who come from broken families who don't do things to go to prison. There are people who come from poor areas who don't do things to go to prison. There are, you know, people, there are success stories in all those cases. So none of these things, and all those people are still sinners, right? But I'm just thinking, what is it that accounts for my sin? I'm thinking, what is it accounts for my heart? I did these things because I enjoyed it. And the Bible's addressing that. It's telling me that my heart is desperately wicked. And it's telling me that in the earliest chapters of the Bible, right? In Genesis 6, God destroys the world, saying that the man's heart is desperately wicked, you know? You know, it says the thoughts and intents of his hearts are only evil continually. I mean, just think about that. The thoughts and intents, it's not just talking about the action, it's talking about the heart, the thoughts, the intents, not just what you do, but what you would intend to do or would do if you could. The intents of the heart are only evil, never good, continually, all the time, right? So I was just like, this book has diagnosed me, and it speaks of a God who truly has the right to claim deity, right? And I'm running into other people that are advocating other religious views at the same time, and none of them had that kind of self-attesting authority. And now as time goes on, you know, the reasons that I would give, I don't think they become something other than this, but my understanding and how I would articulate this now and use it as an argument would grow, is what grows. But yeah, so the Bible convicted me of my sin and spoke to me of the God I knew was there. And you know, essentially it's, you know, Paul says in Romans 1 that all men know God. Nobody has an excuse for their denial of God. The reason people reject God is not because he isn't there. It's not because he has known through the created order and man's own conscience as an image bearer. The reason men don't believe in him is because we're truth suppressors. To acknowledge him is to acknowledge our sin, is to acknowledge we deserve judgment, is to say, you know, that we need to change our lives. Nobody wants to change their lives and serve him rather than themselves or their pleasures. And so we begin doing this from the womb. I mean, we come out of the womb, you know, learning more and more effective ways. And so, you know, the person can hide this even from himself. You know, it's not just others that we're deceiving ourselves, trying to persuade ourselves that God doesn't exist. And people do this in 1,000 ways, just deceiving themselves about some situation, right? They might be, you know, some guy might be deceiving himself that this girl likes him because she smiled at him at the cash register, you know, so he's going in there every day, giving her flowers, or, you know, and no matter how many times or somebody else suddenly comes out to help him instead of her, you know, in other words, she went and asked somebody, hey, can the guy's here again, can you come and help him? You know, he thinks that she's just too shy, she's too embarrassed to face it. You know, people deceive themselves all the time about 100 issues a day, and that's what we're all doing as non-believers when we're in our unregenerate state. And that's I realized the Bible was tearing the mask off that, and so yeah, so I was converted there in the prison. The benefit of reading the Bible every day with a guy who had been there for reading the Bible every day for 10 years. And what's interesting is, and the Presbyterian minister was coming out and teaching theology courses. He was doing something unusual in the prisons. He wasn't just preaching. Some people would come in and preach. He was discipling people and teaching theology courses. So one of the first books I read, besides the Bible, books on my own prior to this, I've read the Bible now several times. Now I'm reading, in addition to that, Burgos' Systematic Theology. And I still marvel at this because, again, remember, I could read. I had no trouble reading, but I was not a reader. And so to go from, you know, not having read any book in years, and the last book I read was The Call of the Wild, which was like a, I don't know, 6th, 7th grade book level. To now reading Burgos was like, I had no trouble reading.
Okay, now wait a second.
But
is this the Burgos with the prolegomena in the beginning?
So I actually have 2 copies. I'll tell you why. In fact, I grabbed one real quick. I'm grabbing 2 copies actually. These got a little dusty. So these ones, these are the old blue copies. You can see mine's worn out a bit here. But this one doesn't have the prolegomena. It just has the systematic theology. At that time, they were publishing them separately. I didn't even know there was a prolegomena until many years later. And I was like, a prolegomena? Yeah, I haven't read that. And
so for people who don't know Burgos, it is an incredibly dense systematic theology. It is academic in tone. It's not easy reading. You know, it's complex reading. There's complex concepts and ideas. You know, and so to be reading this, you know, is like your first piece of nonfiction. You know, is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, and there were times I wanted to throw it down because I wasn't sure I understood what he was talking about. But I ended up reading Burgos several times over the course of my stay in prison. You know, and I did get a lot of books for a prisoner. You know, there were times when the prison would say, you have to get rid of some of these books. And so I would send them home and stuff. But Burgos was a mainstay. I never got rid of my Burgos. I would always refer to it. You know, to this day, I probably haven't read Burgos in, I'm trying to think of the last time I read through the whole thing would have been at least 20 years ago. But to this day, I could open it up and find what I'm looking for within a matter of, you know, probably even remember where something's at on the page. You know, it's just, part of it's just, you know, the Lord, one of the gifts, you know, the Lord has graciously given is if I read something, I can often remember what I read and where I read it. I'll remember what the page looks like. Not quite a photographic memory, but enough that I remember what I read and have a very easy time to open the book and find right where it is. I can remember basically where, how remember if it's in the first quarter of the book, the second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter of the book. Remember if it's on the right side or on the left side, and if it's towards the top or bottom of the page, just those sorts of things. I mean, I could do that with almost any book I've read. And so
I've often been able to do that as well, but what I have found recently is that I've thought things were there that weren't there. So I've told people like, oh yeah, this guy says this on this page, it's in this copy, it's a hardcover, get that, and it's not there. And I'm like, wow, I'm losing my touch. But so
yeah, either that or they got a bum edition. No.
Were you engaging with this pastor that was coming and talking with him and bouncing questions off of him, or?
Oh yeah. So we became really close. He organized this school. One of the things that was different about it was, so the chapel was open to everyone. Everybody could come in there. All these different groups were coming out there to preach and stuff. So you'd get Pentecostals and Baptists and Calvary Chapelites and Presbyterians and just all these different groups, and some worse than others, obviously. And of course the chapel had to be available for other groups to use, like Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and stuff like that. So it was just a real hodgepodge. Plus the people that are going in there, there's no membership or vows or submission to elders or anything like that. So these people, there's no, like, there's just not any kind of church structure. There's nothing like that. It's people are coming in preaching, and people are coming in hearing and leaving, and there's nothing else to it. So there could be no discipline if people were acting in unchristian ways on the yard. And there was, playing church and all the rest. It was something to do. The chapel was an occasion for people to get out of the normal humdrum of the prison environment. Plus, thinking about it, sometimes the groups that would come out, ladies would come with those groups. And so if you think about a prison, prisoners, you're around nothing but men. Just the fact that a lady is going out to the chapel would attract a bunch of the prisoners to go to the chapel, right? Maybe she was there to aid the singing. Maybe she was there as a preacher. Like I say, any group would go out there. And so the only things I would go to were the people that I knew were preaching the Bible soundly, and weren't engaging in a bunch of hoopla, a bunch of antics, hopping up and down and who knows what, throwing chairs. So this guy was also, he started teaching a theology class. That's where he was teaching Burgos. And nobody could be part of his class unless they had a number of things had to be in place. But one thing is they had to have a consistent testimony. What they were saying in the chapel was what they were saying on the yard. What they were doing in their cell was what they were doing in the chapel. They weren't living two different lives. And the way he would determine that was by my roommate that I told you had everybody's respect. He was like his eyes and ears. He knew what was going on in the prison. And he'd tell him, no, this guy, I don't even want to mention what some of these people do in the prison, he'd say, this guy's a drug dealer. This guy, do in the prison that, some of which people are better off not knowing about. But when you read Paul's statement about people inventing ways of doing evil, let me just tell you that that's a reality. When you're limited, you become very creative, and people were creative in the prison. So he discipled me there, as well as the roommate I had, and eventually I got out. I did 2.5 as paroled. So that means you're able to you're able to get out, but you have to complete. It's now like the probation thing I was talking about before. So my total sentence came to about 7.5 years between those different charges that I had. I did 2.5. So that means I completed the 18-month sentence. And then I did, I had the 18-month sentence for that first conviction. Then I had it for the second conviction and a year for the gun charge. But the year and the 5 years ran together. They were concurrent. So when I did 18 months plus a year, the 18-month sentence was gone. 1 year of my 5-in-1 sentence was done, right? The 5 year and 1 year ran together. And so they released me on parole for several years. And so if I complete parole without getting in trouble, then I don't have to do the rest of the sentence. If I get in trouble, I have to do the rest of the sentence. So I was a Christian, though. I got out, and that person who was ministering to me in the prison, he was immediately on my doorstep, was taking me to church. I would spend many days a week with him, every Sunday at least. We would be together. We would talk, and we'd go to church, and sometimes he had a house that was wall-to-wall books, and sometimes he was a lot older than I was, and he would sometimes fall asleep, and that just meant that I had time to go through his library, and I could read anything I want whenever I wanted of his books. But sometimes we'd go back, and I'd like I loved our conversations, but I hope he falls asleep because I'm going to look at that book right there. And it wasn't like he had to sleep before I had permission to do that. I'm saying we were talking, so I couldn't just, I didn't want to, just read a book and, but yeah, I mean, in fact, as you know, I have a lot of books. When he died, his daughter took a lot of his stuff, but I would say I got about 1,000 books from him, from his library. I was allowed to go through and pick what I wanted. 1,000 may be too much, but I did get a lot. I never really counted. I just that's why I say I have 2 Burkoffs, because one was my Burkoff, the other was his Burkoff.
Wow.
And so yeah. So actually it was, the story is that when he died, I told his daughter, I was like, there's only one thing I want. I said, if you can get it for me, I said, I want for me. Remember, this guy has wall-to-wall books. If you can find for me. Oh, and at this point he had been moved to like this assisted living place. Things were different. The circumstances were different, and I didn't have access as much, but I said, I just want his Burkoff. That's the only thing I want. And she was like, oh no. She goes, he wanted you to have, more than that, but
now, did he live long enough to be able to see that you would enter into the ministry?
So he, over the years, so I didn't get to go to seminary as quickly as I wanted to. I wanted to go to seminary as soon as I was converted. I wanted to go, but I was a prisoner, so that didn't work. Plus, I didn't even complete high school. So one of the things I had to do when I got out was, first I got a GED. Then I thought, I'm not content with a GED. I want my official high school diploma. So I went back to high school diploma. Then I had to go to college. Right. And during all this time, I meet my wife to be, we get married, we start having children. So this is slowing down the process, right? Because I had no skill when I went into prison. So I'm not working jobs that are, bringing in much income or anything that could support, any of this, like the schooling and all this other stuff. So it was, just bogged down during all of that. I finally went to school in 2003. I went to college, 2003, 2004. And so we moved away from Vegas, where he lived, to Virginia, where I went to school. I went to Christ College in Virginia. And while we were there, we were so poor. I mean, it was, we took huge pay cuts moving from Vegas to Virginia. I worked for a Indian guy at a Travelodge hotel. He paid me $6 an hour back then. That was minimum wage, I believe, back in 2003. And he paid me $6 an hour. I was so desperate that when he asked if I would work overtime, but for $5, I said yes. So I worked even overtime for $5 instead of the, double time or time and a half or whatever you get for it. And I was going to school full time too. And my wife was pregnant, and because we already had our daughter Katie back in Vegas, we moved there with her. We had our second child. She was pregnant with Alex then. And at the time, we were so poor, there were times when we would eat spaghetti noodles without sauce. We would just use butter. And eventually it was so bad that I had, I went to our local church there and told them, I can't even afford rent this month. Like, we basically eked by until we got to the point where we couldn't pay the rent. And so the church helped us. And then I contacted our church back home, and I told them, we got help this week from our church here, but we were still members at the church in Vegas. We didn't leave the church officially. We moved to go to school, but we're coming back. And so this church was, at the time we were there, but they weren't like our oversight. It wasn't the church that had official oversight over us.
Uh-huh.
And so I wrote our church back home, and they, said, oh, we'll send you the money for next month's rent. They wanted me to finish school and stuff. But I realized, unless I had some standing offer to pay every month, there was no way I was going to, we had basically used up all of our savings and everything else at the time we were there, and I was making so little. And I thought, it's not going to go away. So I'm going to need to ask again and say, we need help. So basically we decided to move back to Vegas and try and regroup. She would have the help of our family in addition, because she's, I'm working and going to school the whole time, and she's just poor and barely able to eat. And so I'm thinking I can go get a better job in Vegas, take care of her, and she'd have her family on top of it to help, now that she's 2 kids and other stuff that she would take care of. So we moved back to Vegas, and I did get a good job, and she actually got a good job while the kids were young. Both of us were working. We eventually would decide to homeschool them. They've all been homeschooled, their whole lives, but we didn't, she wasn't homeschooling them when they were first born and stuff. So she was able to work and all that, but we had both had these great jobs. And I got into this in Vegas. I worked it for at least 10 years, and they pay extremely well, excellent insurance. I'd get a whole month off a year. It was great. So, but it was a tough job too.
What, I lost you there. What'd you say it was?
Transportation. I drove the buses in the city of Vegas.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So it was an excellent job, good pay, good benefits and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But it was all picking up, people on the streets, and that means anything from, people that are going to work, to homeless people, to criminals using the bus as a getaway system or a hideout or whatever. So it was quite an affair. I could tell you bus story after bus story, people pulling guns on me and all this other good stuff. Yeah, so actually, so I talking with Dean once we come back from Vegas, because I didn't really talk to him a lot while I was in Virginia going to school. Things were just too busy, and it wasn't as easy back then. People didn't just have cell phones, right? Not everybody, I don't even remember what the state of cell phones were at the time, but even if there were cell phones, it was more expensive to call somebody on a cell phone. And there were just other complications, but he was also old fashioned, so I don't really recall him having a cell phone. So she was trying to get a hold of him. We just didn't talk a whole lot. And I wasn't trying to be a burden to anyone, so that was my thinking, just not really broadcast this. And so when I come back, he was like, why didn't you tell me, why didn't you tell me you're out there struggling? Because I would have helped you. And I'm like, well, I'm thinking, yeah, that's precisely why I didn't tell you, because he's an individual, and he was a sergeant major in the military. So he drew money from that. And he taught in these educators in Nevada, so he drew money from that. But he was also, he had a doctorate in theology. And before being a Presbyterian minister, he was educated in what was called Reformed Episcopal Seminary.
Okay. Yeah.
So he's Reformed, but over time he became Presbyterian. He realized that there were some things about the Episcopal Church that he didn't like. They were going liberal. There were all sorts of other things. So he becomes a Presbyterian minister before I meet him, right? But retired from the military, retired from the education system, but he's drawing a fixed income from these things. And that's what he's living on. And this is what he's using to support the prison ministry, because he's going out to the prisons on his own dime. And so I'm thinking, yeah, I know that he would help me, but I'm not going to burden him like that. That's, so anyways, this was another road bump in my road to seminary. So I only did 2 years of college, didn't finish the 4 years. So, I mean, I did get an AA there in Christian thought or Christian philosophy. But so then we come back to Vegas, and that's when I started doing the bus job, and I did that for 10 years. But during this time, I'm still active. I'm witnessing, I'm evangelizing, I'm engaging in apologetics. I started writing for various websites. I started writing for Answering Islam, Answering Muslims.com, debates with people. I'm engaging people on the streets. I'm teaching at my local church. I'm doing all sorts of things. And one day while I was teaching a class, because if you have any kind of calling, you can't just sit on it. And so to me, even though I hadn't finished these steps, it was like I was still, there was this necessity in me that I had to be doing things, and I did them to whatever extent was legitimate, given my I wasn't a pastor or anything, so I couldn't do certain things. But anyways, one day when I was teaching a class, the pastor of the church that we were at, my wife was at a dinner with their family and some other people, and he was like, that boy, he's from the South. He was like, that boy needs to be in seminary. And my wife was like, she heard that, and she just sort of, and one thing I didn't mention that it was really hard on my wife. I didn't really get into the details of that, but that was back in 2003 and 4, when our situation was so rough that it was really hard on her. And so I didn't want to, even though we'd returned to Vegas, I didn't want to just turn around and go back to seminary once, after a year or something, because I thought, we're just going to be in a similar situation. I'm going to get into a job in one of these places that doesn't pay a whole lot. I'm going to be working full time, going to school full time, have no time for her and the kids, and then she's going to be poor on top of it. I'm just thinking of these sorts of things, and I'm like, I don't want to just drag her through that again. And it was very hard for her during all of that. So I'm thinking a lot about her situation. But so the pastor says that boy needs to be in seminary. And so that's just sort of, turned a light on for her. And then she goes over to some friends of ours' house later that week or whatever. And the husband, or no, the wife says to my wife, she goes, we've decided to go to seminary. My husband's going to go to seminary. You guys should come with us. Tony should really be in seminary. And my wife was like, huh, these other people, saying this too. And then we have this very wealthy friend of ours, a very dear friend, but very wealthy. And I mention that because my wife is with her, or she comes, I think it was, she came up to her at church, walked over, and basically she said to her, she goes, you know what? She goes, I really think that boy needs to be in seminary. She didn't say boy, I'm quoting my pastor now, but she goes, I really think he needs to be in seminary. And she says, she goes, I'd be willing to pay to move you guys wherever you need to go, and make this a reality, and so my wife was like, gosh, 3 people. Now our financial situation is a lot different now. We are going to take you, but my wife has also grown and changed a lot, and she's like, I can handle this time, in ways I didn't. So I was like, because she comes to me and she tells me, hey, she goes, I realize you didn't finish a lot of this because of me. And she says, I'm ready. If you want to go, she goes, and I was, as soon as she said that, I was probably already packing. I was already packing up the seminary. But I should include this. I don't know how much longer you wanted to go, but I should include this because this, some people will remember how we started out. And everything actually comes full circle here. So when I go to the seminary, my original thought is that I would become a pastor somewhere, and maybe even be able to teach at a seminary eventually once I got higher degrees and stuff. Because I love pastoral stuff, love teaching as well. But my real thoughts were down forward to what I really want to do is prison ministry. Okay, but I'm thinking of prison ministry as it was modeled by this gentleman who ministered to me. He was older, he was retired, his kids were grown, so they weren't in the house anymore. He didn't have to go work a job and then go into the prison and neglect them. I mean, there was just, he had a whole different situation, and he was supported by means of income that he drew from these jobs that he'd worked for decades. So I was kind of thinking along the same lines. I need to be able to support this in addition to a job. And so this is down the road, right? So I'm thinking long-term, that's what I really want to do is prison ministry, but I'm not in a position to do that and won't be for a long time. So while I'm at seminary, I'm preparing to do something else. We were looking into, I came here and told the seminary and told the professors and pastors out here, I said, hey, I'm willing to do anything. I'm willing to go anywhere. You aim and shoot and I'll go. And so we were looking at a couple of places, Uganda because there's Muslims to the north and Christians to the south, I think it is the situation there. And so they thought I would be well situated there to serve. O. Palmer Robertson, you've heard of him, has a Bible college there. And so it was thought that I could be of good use to the Christians there and also engage the Muslims. And so I was thinking of that. And similarly in Italy, there's one Reformed church that I know of in central Italy. There could be some others, but they're not advertising per se as such. And there had been an influx of Muslims because of their immigration policy there. Muslims were coming in to flee their own bad countries. And so the local Italians were getting upset, and I thought I could be useful there. I could minister to Christians and engage Muslims. And so those were the plans. But while I was in seminary, the last year, my youngest daughter became sick. She got a protracted illness. We realized we wouldn't be able to get good health care for her in other places. So I realized I couldn't just leave the country once I graduate. And now I'm scrambling to figure out what am I going to do now? Because these were the plans. We were seriously looking at these things. And I got together with my pastor at the time one day, and we were having lunch and just talking about options. And he was talking to me about different churches and different places and just different things. And I just, out of nowhere, just said, really like to do. I said, I'd like to do prison ministry, but it's just too bad. It's, I've got to be able to support my family too, and how can I support this and support my family? That obviously prisoners aren't going to be able to help me meet my own income. And I'm not, obviously not going in there to, for that per se. But my pastor was like, what are you talking about? He goes, of course you can. He goes, of course you can do that. And, I kicked myself. I often think in a very limited way, like, parameters in view, and don't think of, the fact that these are not necessarily, these aren't inflexible things, right? There are other ways to do certain things. And he was like, he told me that he knows of a ministry. And so here's the incredible thing. So my pastor says, I'm going to call a guy. I know a guy. I'm going to call him and see if he's got any options for you. And so he called Mark, national director for Metanoia Prison Ministries, which is a branch of Mission to North America, which is the PCA's, the Presbyterian Church of America's missions agency. And he calls up Mark Hassan like 10 minutes after we left our lunch meeting. And he says, hey, he goes, I got this guy here, and he tells him all about me, so on and so forth. And Mark Hassan says, you're not going to believe this. He says, I just got up off my knees. Literally, I was praying and asking God to send us somebody in South Carolina to head up the prison work there, because the ministry is designed to be in all the United States, but it's not yet up and running in every state, right? There are prison ministries, I'm sure. Faithful churches are ministering in prisons everywhere, but as far as what they're doing, Metanoia, they're not in every state yet. And so they're trying to expand it into South Carolina, but they needed somebody that would come and do it. In addition to that, to make this so you can see even how much more remarkable it was, not only was he just getting off his knees and praying, he said, I had also already planned, because he doesn't live here in South Carolina. He says, I also was already planning to be in South Carolina this coming Lord's Day to scout out somebody. And I was planning to come to your church in the evening. So he had already, he was praying for this, and he was already planning to go to the church that I go to coming Sunday in the evening, and had no idea. And I had no idea. This whole time I'm planning, I want to do this, the prison ministry, but I'm planning to do these things because I'm thinking, oh, this isn't a possibility at this point. And so it's a remarkable thing. People don't know what the Lord is doing, right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes people get upset that their plans are thwarted or frustrated. But here's an example of just how foolish we are. There's no reason to be bent out of shape. You're not God. You don't control things, insight into how things should go. And if things don't work out the way you went, then praise God, because you know that he's working out his sovereign purposes for a much greater, and glorious end.
Proverbs 16:9, the heart of a man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. Okay, so just the last part of this. So, you've moved to South Carolina, you've established a family, you've gone through seminary, you're now involved with Metanoia Prison Ministries, and then one day you get this phone call from someone related to you. What happens there?
Yeah, well, so while I was in seminary, a lot of things happened that were, pretty big, not just, speed bumps. And I started to think that all of my, I think we were talking before the show about, additional education. You said, if you want to do this or that, there's this great thing here, and mm-hmm. this great thing there. My educational forays have coincided with some major testing So the first ground of testing when I went to college back in 03 and 04 was we were hit seriously financially. So there was a serious financial challenge, right? Like I say, we were eating, basically living off of top ramen or spaghetti noodles without any pasta sauce. Then seminary, we were hit with physical sicknesses in our family. It still seems to be making the rounds, but the big issue was my youngest daughter became seriously ill with what they call mast cell activation syndrome, which is only one of the things that she has, but it involves her becoming, she has adverse reactions to all foods and smells. It causes intense internal burning, and we've just done all sorts to try and deal with that. And the things that you do to deal with that medically and so forth have their own symptoms and create other issues. So I mean, it's been a huge thing. So we don't even eat or drink in our house, as you know, because she can't be around any foods or smells without it setting her off. She'll have allergic reactions on her skin, but at the very least, she'll just, internally feel horrible. So she eats through, she has a tube in her stomach that she eats through. She gets formula through. So that was one thing that happened in seminary education. And the book of Job started to become very precious to me, where Job is going through these various testings. First, with respect to his possessions, he loses his possessions. Then with respect to his family, he loses his children. Then with respect to his own body, he starts feeling, getting his own, physical issues. So that wasn't the only thing. That was one thing that happened while I was in seminary. But the last, I would say, the last semester, I think it was, I might have the dates a little bit off, but semester of seminary, I got a phone call from a girl and found out that I had a daughter who was 23 years old at the time. So when I went into the prison, I went into prison when I was 18, just about to turn 19. I had a girlfriend at the time. I was actually officially still in high school. Remember, I didn't finish high school, but I had turned 18 in high school and went to jail and was just cut off from the girlfriend I had and everything else. And since I never heard from her in the jail or the 2.5 years I was in the prison, I just assumed that was over, and I had got out. I didn't go looking for her. I didn't go looking for anyone from my old life. I just followed the Lord. And so 23 years later, she calls me and tells me that I'm her dad. And I couldn't believe it. So she was raised without me, and she wasn't raised as a believer. So that's, the real difficult aspect of this. Otherwise, getting to know her has been great and everything else. But, just the fact that I, didn't raise her and she doesn't, those were the hardest things to swallow. But the Lord is gracious. I trust in his providence and hope for her conversion. We still talk, I'd say for the first 2 years, we probably talked almost every day uninterrupted, without missing a day. But, life gets busy and things, so we don't talk every day now. But, and then I see her. My mom still lives in Las Vegas, which is where my daughter lives, the one we were just talking about. Yeah, so I've had people, I've given you, even with all my rambling and my tangents, I've given you the brief version and left out some of the colorful details. I had one friend who's a missionary now in Albania. He says, every time I've told him about some, whether it was any of the stuff I've told you or any of the other stuff that I didn't mention right now, he's like, man, he goes, your life is like a movie. he goes, we need to make a movie out of this. And I'm like, gosh, well, I don't really see it that way. Maybe it's a horror flick. No, I mean, I'm not at all, I rejoice in all of this. The Lord is good. I'm happy he's sovereign. But yeah, I mean.
Well, good. I think it's a tremendous story.
There have been some say.
I love to hear about it because I love to hear, you could feel the fingerprints of God's grace, as it were, and so that's tremendous. And so, all right, I'm going to put this up on YouTube and hopefully people will watch it. I'm sure they will because it is a fascinating story. And I appreciate you giving your entire morning to me. And
yeah,
I hope that that people will be blessed by that testimony. I'm certain I'm already blessed for the day. So thank you much, Tony. It was good to